Hello and welcome. This course is CH2105. It's the History of the United Church of Canada for the fall term of 2020. My name is Ross Bartlett, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be working with you this term. As we begin this term, I want to acknowledge that the buildings of AST are found in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territories of the Mi'kmaq, and that long before the history which we will be studying began to be written, history was already in existence because these peoples had moved and lived and worked and cared for these lands for time out of memory. And so, as we look at what is, in fact, just a small fraction of the story of this land on Turtle Island, we acknowledge their stewardship with gratitude. We seek to live with respect to all the inhabitants of this place, so that the story we write might be worthy to be heard by further generations, and they might say of us that we lived the right path. And as we begin our term, I invite you to pray with me. Holy and loving one who writes all of our histories in your great book of life, bless us with open minds and inquisitive hearts, with spirits that seek to hear and to know the truth of what has occurred, so that we might in our time be good inheritors and faithful stewards of the real story of your people, which is the United Church of Canada. In this strange time when we cannot be present with one another in person, help us to reach over the gaps and through the kilometers to connect in this virtual fashion, so that each might know that they are an important part of the circle of learning and growth. And as your children have taught us, may we always remember that in the circle of sharing, there are no empty vessels. And so bless all our work this term, we pray. O great teller of all of our stories. Amen. As we begin our time together, I'd like to pose some questions for you to think about. I think they're important as we begin this exploration in what, for some of you, may be a new field of study. First question is, why are you taking this course? Or, perhaps more honestly, because you may be here only because it is required of you, what do you hope you will gain from this course? I do really want you to think about that, because as adult learners, your motivation is very important in your learning. So here's another question to think about. What comes to mind when you consider or think about the study of history? One of my most fortunate experiences in life was when, as a young person, perhaps grade 7 or 8, I encountered teachers who moved history away from the memorization of names and dates to the real lives of real people. For too many folk in our educational system, their memories of grade school and high school history is caught up with the memorization of apparently useless facts. That's not very good history. When we move beyond the names of the dates, then we begin to discover some important things. Something we need to recognize is that all history comes from a point of view. All stories are told from a perspective. So once we move beyond the bare bones of this event happened on such and such a date and these people were present, we are into a point of view. Technically, that's called an ideology, which simply means a manner of thinking or the ideas at the basis of some system or means of analysis. And this is particularly true with religious or church history. Here's a couple of examples. Many years ago, 1975 or 6, I believe, I was in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and on a tour, and our tour guide referred to the Great English Bourgeois Revolution. Now, I'm a student of history, even back then, and I'd never heard of the Great English Bourgeois Revolution. But what she had in mind is what you and I may have been taught to call the English Civil War. Speaking of civil wars, while I was doing work at Princeton, I heard a phrase I'd never encountered before. I'd been raised to call it the American Civil War. Classmates from the southern states referred to it as the War of Northern Aggression. So, you see, even in something as simple as what we name a thing, some viewpoint or ideology kicks in. Even the title of this course has an ideology to it. The name United Church History assumes that there is such a thing as the United Church of Canada, that we can somehow identify items in its story, that we can name such things as church history and identify them distinctly from events in the society, and it further assumes the existence of a field of study called history with texts and methods for the endeavor. Now, I'll admit, some of those seem pretty basic and easy to identify, but it shows that clarity about language is important. Words matter. How we describe something is important. So, why do we study history? Well, the first reason is a purely utilitarian one. We did not drop into this place in time all on our own. The church we have today, and even in our own lives, they are products of different forces. Most of us are parts of communities of faith that have a history. That history, for good or ill, continues to influence us today. If we do the work to better understand those factors, we can be more effective today. Now, there are different forms of history. Just as there are different forms of biblical interpretation and different schools of pastoral care or theology. Different schools of history will focus in different areas of the human story and will provide different results. Some of the historical schools are these. Economic history focuses on economic concerns, employment, spending, and so on. Social history focuses on organizations that people create as a door to insight into the story. Military history focuses on conflict as the great driver of human society. The history of ideas focuses on the writings and ideas as the prime shapers of the human story. Those are just a few of the historical schools. In this course, you and I will primarily engage in social and intellectual history. In other words, we will focus on groups and organizations and movements of people and the writings of key individuals and groups. Our social location or our context also makes a difference. We are engaged in this study of history through a theological school. That adds another layer on top. The fact that most of you are preparing to give leadership in Christian communities adds yet another dimension. In religious circles, there is a practice that sometimes masquerades as history, but is actually a distorted form of propaganda. This is what it looks like. It's not history. It involves developing an idea or establishing a position, perhaps a position of faith, and then ransacking the storehouse of the past to find examples that support our ideas. That's not the way we'll do history. Let me give you an example that comes from a tragic event in comparatively recent history. In April 1999, at Columbine High School near Denver, 2 teenage boys went on a murderous rampage, killing several students and teachers. Now, in media reports after the fact, there were numerous references to survivors speaking of angels protecting them. Now, consider that you were looking at the events at Columbine High School as a subject for historical research and writing. What could we focus on? What could we legitimately say as historians? Well, firstly, we can establish pretty clearly that the event took place on a certain day at a certain location. Two individuals appear to be the prime perpetrators. Number three, these individuals were killed outright. These were wounded or died. These were wounded and survived. There was a path that the assailants took through the school, and police have discovered these tangible things about the perpetrators: website presence, stashes of weapons, written materials, and so on and so on and so on. We might label those the facts of the event. Those are the historical facts with which you as the historian will work. But much beyond reporting the facts becomes a matter of interpretation. So depending on what you as the historian were interested in, you might develop the following. You might develop theories as to why teenage American boys become murderous. Maybe theories about the benefits or downsides of suburban American life. Theories about gun control. Theories about the presence or absence of angels in that event. We call that interpretation. Interpretation is an absolutely legitimate historical endeavor. Most historians go about their work because in some way we want to understand why something occurred. Most historians want to try and figure out how A, motivation, reasons, background, relates to B, historical events. With that in mind, the difference between facts and interpretation, let's ponder that claim of divine intervention. What can you, as the historian, legitimately do? You can, number one, talk about what participants believe to be true, whether you accept it or not. You can, too, talk about your own belief about what happened, regardless of whether the participants named that as a factor. What you're not free to do is to say that something happened which didn't. That's just dishonest. You're not free to avoid an obvious explanation for an event. That's foolish. You're not free to deny what people claim as their own experience, even though you are free to disagree with their interpretation of that experience. So, for instance, you can't say that somebody who claims to have seen an angel is clearly not seeing an angel, but you can develop a theory to explain why you think that's a mistaken claim. And you can't say that God did something as a fact statement rather than a belief statement. That's the problem with much of what masquerades as really bad religious history, the claim that God did something as if it's an assertion of fact rather than a statement of belief. As an assertion of belief, that takes the matter out of the realm of historical discourse and turns it into apologetics. And you are, I suppose, free to claim that God did something in any aspect of life, but not as a historian. The actions of God, apart from human understanding of those actions, are not within the capacity of the historian to address. Does that mean you must bracket or closet or deny your faith when you do history? Absolutely not. St. Augustine, for example, believed that Christian history is neither a deterministic system nor a meaningless chaos. You can share that belief. And if you are so motivated, you can see in the events of history evidence of judgment, mercy, moral meaning, spiritual significance, and so on. You are also constrained as a limited human being to recognize that no justice, mercy, meaning, or significance is utterly unambiguous. You must own the conclusions you arrive at rather than offering them as absolutes. Martin Luther wrote about the hiddenness of God in history. There is mystery as well as purpose in the unfolding historical drama. The challenge is always to maintain a balance between over-assurance and over-diffidence. At the risk of sweeping generalizations, here are some of the marks of the historian who is also a Christian believer. He, she, they are wary of universals. For instance, when someone says everyone knows or experience tells us, we've learned that such statements usually reveal only the experience of a particular group, generally the dominant group in society. Beware of making universal, sweeping statements. The historian is aware of their own assumptions. Alarm bells should go off in our heads when something seems obvious to us. We should ask ourselves, are we reading or writing something from our own time into the lives of people in the past? The historian recognizes that judgment is unavoidable. The facts we choose to include or leave out, the way we set them down, and so on, all those involve judgments on our part. We will engage in judgments. On what basis are those judgments made? The historian is realistic and open-minded. Human nature as we encounter it in history can be pretty shocking. It is often hard as a historian to sustain a notion of the universal goodness and the so-called perfectibility of humankind. On the other hand, it's inappropriate to give in to pure cynicism and say that people only do these things for personal profit. There are times when people act better than we expect of them. There are also times when the results can turn out better than the sordid beginnings would lead us to hope. So, let's return for a moment to our opening question. I asked you what comes to mind when you think of the study of history. But now I want to change that slightly and ask, why do you think that church history is a required part of your course of study and of the traditional seminary program? In other words, why bother with history? Well, most of my life, working life, I've been both a parish pastor and a professional historian. I am someone who reads, teaches, and writes history. And let me tell you what the study of history means to me. By studying history, I think we can enter into a conversation with those who have gone before us carrying the Christian tradition. We are trying to hear the voices left behind as clearly as possible. The first goal of studying history is to try and comprehend what their situation meant to those people who were involved in it. And let me warn you, that's harder than it may sound. For we are all historical actors. We are all making history. And our motives and our actions are hardly ever focused singly. Take us, for example. Supposing someone were to write the story of the class of Church History 2105 in the fall of term 2020. They could write that the members of the class had these names. They might note that because of COVID-19, instead of being in person, the class had to be conducted virtually. They could say that they met online for 12 weeks from September to December, that the instructor was Ross Bartlett, and so far that's pretty boring history. It's when you start to push on any of those things that the story gets interesting. Who are these people, really? What motivated them to participate? What was the relationship between them? What about the instructor? Beyond the rather boring titles of his presentations, what did he say or do? What happened in those sessions? That's when history begins to come alive, as we seek to understand the whole story of the people who went before us. What about us? The study of history in this context, in other words, as part of a professional degree leading to a professional vocation, the study of history is an attempt to understand ourselves. How did we get here? Because the people and situations we study shape who we are today. We don't just spring into being out of nothing. We come from somewhere. Our traditions, our convictions, concerns, attitudes, beliefs, practices, everything that we call church. Whether we like it or don't like it, whether we wish to continue it or wish to alter it, everything is shaped in part by those who went before us. And so we take that material, what we might call that deposit of the tradition, and we shape it again and again, and we will pass it on to the next generation. So in studying history, we are attempting to arrive at a clear understanding of what's been passed on to us. In study of history, at least at this level, we take our own concerns into the story. And that's why there's some freedom in this course to explore things in the church's story that really interest you. We might say, I'm interested why we sit in rows. Or, why do we use little glasses for communion? Or why is it that the church feels it has to make statements on social issues? I'm interested in church music. And many others. So what I'm inviting you to do in this course is to take the opportunity to follow what interests you and then come back and report on what you discover. That's when you are really acting as a historian. You're tracing down the roots of an issue that is alive and real for you today in the church. It's important to recognize that history is not just the memorizations of dates and names. Dates are crucial markers if we want to find our way through the highways of time. For instance, in eras past, most people would judge their lives and mark time on the basis of who was on the throne or who was the pope or whatever. So knowing those dates are significant. There's something very important in the understanding of European and Western history to know that in 1492, not only did somebody by the name of Columbus first encounter what came to be called the Americas, but Gutenberg popularized and finished his movable printing press, which led to an explosion of literacy and knowledge in Europe. So there's a geographic expansion and an expansion of literacy and knowledge at the same time. So to make those connections, you need to know the dates they occurred. It's also helpful for us in our context to know when the First World War began or who the moderator was or prime minister at different times, because those can serve as guideposts of how society is evolving or how the church is changing. Our study is not purely academic in the worst sense of the word. We are coming from an ideological position. We are interested in history. I believe that the people to whom you will preach are genuinely interested in their story to the extent that it helps them understand who they are and learn about themselves. So, what will we be doing this term? You might want to take a break, and when you come back, have the course outline or syllabus handy, because we'll be walking through that. Okay, so let's look at the outline for this course. It's presented online. We'll be gathering by Zoom teleconference Thursday, and I have 2 till 4:30 in there, but it won't be that long, and I'll explain why that is. We won't require a full 2.5 hours every week unless you want to use it. My email address is there. I encourage you, if you need to contact me by email, to do so through that address rather than putting emails into the bright space. I'm not quite sure where those go. I know from experience they haven't reached me. The number there is my cell phone number. Since the offices are closed, I won't be taking calls at the office numbers, but you're welcome to use my cell phone number. The course outline, the learning objectives, the general matters, the participation, your presence in our Thursday gatherings is really important because you are a resource to one another as we chew away at and explore various aspects of the course. The texts required, there are only two texts that are required. The two most recent histories of the United Church of Canada. They may well be available in e-books at this point. I think the Schweitzer is. I'm not sure about Phyllis Earhart's book. As well, on the Brightspace location, there will be supplemental readings. And most of the supplemental readings are primary sources, meaning that they are written at the very time that we're looking at. And so that is another way of getting into the mindset of some of the people in the living through the subjects that we're talking about. So, here's the flow of the course. Please complete the week's lessons before listening to the lectures. Monday evening, you will have posted a reflection, and I'll say more about that in a minute. By Wednesday evening, a video recording of a lecture will be available on the Brightspace site. Some people in past courses have said they like to listen to their lectures while they're doing their jogging or walking or whatever. So if you want purely an audio version, that can also be made available. Please, you only have to let me know. And then on Thursday, we'll meet. We'll talk about the lecture, the readings, your reflections, and so on. And each of you will prepare 2 papers or presentations. The first is due on October the 15th, and the second is November the 26th. So, a little more detail. Readings. The readings from Schweitzer and Earhart. All other readings will be available electronically on Brightspace. Each week, you will post a reflection on Brightspace, and the focus and purpose are to deepen your consideration of the material under discussion, to understand the relevance of the Church's story in our contemporary experience, and to focus on ways in which knowing our story can enhance our own effectiveness in ministry. And you're working on the previous week's topic. You can use it to synthesize. You can use it to anchor your learning. It's just a few paragraphs, anything up to 2 pages, and you don't have to go that far. The format is quite straightforward, and it's one that you may have encountered with me before. Name 3 things that you've learned from the material and why that learning is important. Name 2 questions that you still have. Name 1 thing that you derived that will affect your ministry and why. You can use it to do other things too. Note potential problems with the arguments made in the lecture. Lectures may not be all they're cracked up to be. Challenge what you read or you heard. Relate ideas to what you heard in your ministry context. Each week you are expected to respond to at least one of your classmates' reflections, but you may respond to more. 2 essays are going to be required this term. Reading, watching, hearing, you can respond to these questions in a more formal academic style. Usual attributes of good scholarship, and so on. These are for you to explore things that are of interest to you. And so please send me the topics that you want to take on. The first one can be either a short essay or a video presentation. Can be on any subject directly related to the course. It can be a 1,500 to 2,000 word essay or 10 to 12 minutes in a video presentation. And there are discussions, there are suggestions there about what you need to cover. There are also the things that you need to do if you're doing a video presentation. You have to submit the material you're working from. Please note, too many words is not necessarily a good thing. Length is important. If you can't make the argument you want in the allotted space, you probably are being either too wordy, you've bitten up too much to chew, or you don't understand it fully. You haven't synthesized it enough. The final research essay is in fact an essay. on any subject directly related to this course. In other words, anything directly related to the history of the United Church of Canada. Not the same topic as the short essay presentation, 3,000 to 4,000 words. Please submit a plan or a proposal for your topic not later than the 5th of November. And there's the evaluation. When I turn to the course itinerary, the dates are given for the Thursday when the class meets, posting your reflections and responses in the 7 days that follow that. And so we move through the founding genius of the United Church, the social gospel. What was the United Church's sense of mission in this era? Generally, I give you readings. Sometimes I will give you for further reading, which is not required, but something may have sparked your interest. Sense of mission, and so on. The full reading week, no reflections or responses are due that week, and so on to the end of the course. One note about the last meeting of our course. You can give me by email questions that haven't been dealt with. So things that you are still wrestling with, questions that are still outstanding, and you can send them to me by the 29th of November, and I will deal with them in the final meeting of the class. Okay? So that's the course outline. Please take a look at it and ask me any questions. I look forward to seeing you in class on Thursday.